The hiss of steam is a serpent's whisper in the iron heart of the locomotive. It is a constant, a living breath in the frozen air of the Wyoming territories, and for 12 hours, it has been Alara's only companion. The cold seeps through the thin fabric of her dress, a dress meant for a wedding, not for a vigil in the bowels of a stalled engine. Her hands, wrapped in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat, are a raw, blistering agony. Each time she grips the handle of the coal shovel, a fresh wave of fire lances up her arms. The fireman, a hulk of a man named Gus, had collapsed hours ago, his body racked with a fever that turned his skin to parchment and his eyes to glass. The engineer, a wiry, panicked man called Miller, had been desperate. The train, a lifeline of steel stretching across an unforgiving continent, was dead on the tracks, a blizzard howling down from the mountains to bury it. Without steady heat in the boiler, the water lines would freeze, crack, and the engine would become a multi-ton tomb of useless iron. They would all be stranded, perhaps for good. That's when Alara had stepped forward, a ghost in the swirling snow on the platform of a tiny depot 2 days back. She had watched her future evaporate as the man who had summoned her from Pennsylvania, a Mr. Silas Croft, never appeared. With $7 to her name and a trunk full of hopeful linens, she was nothing. The station master had no answers. The telegram she sent went unanswered. She was a piece of mail, lost in transit. When Miller had announced the fireman's collapse to the handful of crewmen, his voice tight with fear, Alara had seen her only chance. It wasn't a choice, it was survival. She had offered her labor in exchange for passage to Cheyenne, the next major stop, a place where a woman might find work that didn't involve a wedding band. Miller had laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. But then he'd looked at the dead weight of Gus, at the swirling snow, and at the unwavering, desperate resolve in her eyes. He'd agreed. Now, she moves in a fugue state of exhaustion. Scoop, lift, swing, open, toss. The firebox door is a glowing, demonic mouth, its heat a blistering counterpoint to the Arctic cold at her back. Scoop, lift, swing. The rhythmic clang of the shovel against the coal pile, the roar of the flames as they consume her offering, the constant, sibilant hiss of the boiler. These are the sounds that have replaced the world. Her mind is a dull, gray fog. She thinks of her mother's hands, kneading dough. She thinks of the green hills of her home, so far away they might as well be a dream. She thinks of nothing at all, just the shovel, just the fire, just the hiss. She promised herself she would not stop. She promised herself she would not fail. But the body is a traitor to the will. Her arms tremble, not from cold, but from utter depletion. Her vision swims. The serpent's hiss seems to grow louder, coiling around her, pulling her down into a warm, humming darkness. She stumbles, the shovel clattering to the steel floor. With the last of her strength, she leans against the massive, warm curve of the boiler itself, the gentle vibration of final, soothing touch. Her eyes drift shut. She doesn't know that the train is more than just a train, or that its most important passenger, a man who measures his life in miles of track and mountains of gold, is about to come looking for the source of the delay. And with a quiet push of the engine cab door, his life and hers were irrevocably changed. That was a close call. Before we see how Alara navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. She slumped against the warm metal, the rhythmic hiss of the boiler a final lullaby, unaware that the owner of the entire line was about to find her there. The world that had abandoned her was about to walk in her cramped, iron sanctuary, and he would not be what she, or anyone, expected. In the opulent confines of the rearmost carriage, Julian Croft stared out at the white, churning chaos of the blizzard and felt a familiar, bitter frustration. His car, the Atlas, was a palace on wheels, polished mahogany, green velvet upholstery, crystal decanters filled with amber whiskey. It was a rolling testament to his power, a symbol of the empire he had carved out of wilderness and rock, bribery and sweat. And right now, it was utterly, infuriatingly useless. He was a man who commanded legions of men, who could move mountains with a signature on a piece of paper, who dined with senators and broke robber barons. But he could not command the snow, and he could not command a broken-down engine. He had been stranded for nearly 24 hours. A vital negotiation awaited him in Cheyenne, a meeting that could secure the southern spur through to the silver mines in Colorado or see it fall into the hands of his rivals. Every hour they sat here, his advantage bled away into the snow. Julian was not a man given to idleness. He was 45, though the silver at his temples and the deep lines etched around his cool gray eyes made him look older. He had built the Great Western Rail from a handful of bankrupt lines into a continental artery, a task that had consumed his youth, his health, and his only marriage. He was a creature of motion, of progress, of relentless forward momentum. This stasis was a kind of hell. His steward, a silent, efficient man named Pierce, had just informed him that the fireman was incapacitated. "Miller is managing, sir," Pierce had reported, his face impassive. "But he's concerned about maintaining boiler pressure if this continues." Julian ran a hand over his face, the starched collar of his shirt suddenly feeling like a vice. He had started his own career not in a boardroom, but on the footplate of an engine just like the one now failing him. He knew the smell of hot oil and coal smoke better than he knew the scent of any perfume. He knew the intricate, brutal mechanics of the beast, the precise balance of fire and water and steam that gave it life. He trusted his own knowledge far more than he trusted a flustered engineer. "Get my coat," he said, his voice clipped. Pierce blinked, the first crack in his professional facade. "Sir, the storm. I'm not made of sugar, Pierce. I want to see the problem for myself." Bundled in a heavy greatcoat, Julian stepped out of his gilded cage and into the raging heart of the storm. The wind was a physical blow, tearing the breath from his lungs and plastering his face with ice crystals. He fought his way along the side of the train, his hand trailing along the frozen steel of the passenger cars, a string of dark, silent coffins in the gloom. The shrieking wind swallowed all sound but its own, a primal scream that echoed the savage emptiness of the landscape. He finally reached the engine, a massive black shape hulking against the white fury. He hauled himself up the icy steps and into the tender, the coal crunching under his expensive leather boots. The relative quiet of the cab was a relief. The air was thick with the familiar, acrid smell of coal and hot metal. He saw the engineer, Miller, hunched over a gauge, his face pale and slick with sweat in the dim lantern light. Gus, the fireman, was a heap of blankets in a corner, his breathing shallow and ragged. But the boiler pressure was holding. The needle on the gauge was steady, quivering right where it should be. The fire in the firebox roared with a healthy, vibrant life. Miller hadn't been able to do this alone, not for this long. "Miller," Julian's voice cut through the hiss and rumble. The engineer jumped as if struck by lightning, spinning around. His eyes widened in sheer terror as he recognized the face from the company portraits. Mr. Croft." "Sir," he stammered, snatching his cap from his head. We're doing everything we can, sir. The blizzard, the pressure is stable," Julian interrupted, his gaze sweeping the cab. "Gus is out. Who's been stoking this fire?" Miller's face, already pale, seemed to lose all its remaining color. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He gestured vaguely toward the far side of the boiler, a space cast in deep shadow. I made an arrangement, sir. A temporary measure, just to get us through." Julian's eyes narrowed. He distrusted euphemisms. They were cousins to lies. He stepped past the bewildered engineer, his boots crunching on stray bits of coal. He rounded the immense, warm curve of the boiler, the source of the engine's life, and stopped. There, curled in a space no bigger than a shipping crate, was a woman. Or a girl, it was hard to tell. She was slumped in sleep, her head pillowed against the riveted steel plates, her body limp with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to have dissolved her very bones. One arm was flung out, her fingers nearly touching a large, discarded coal shovel. Her dress was simple, dark, and smudged with grease and soot. Her face, turned toward the dim light of the firebox, was a mask of grime, but even through it, he could see the delicate line of her jaw, the soft curve of her lips. Her hair, a chestnut brown, had escaped its pins and clung in damp tendrils to her forehead. Her hands, resting in her lap, were a horror. The makeshift bandages of torn white cloth were stained dark with blood and black with cold dust. For a long moment, Julian Croft, the man of iron and will, could not move. He simply stared. He had seen men broken by the railroad, crushed by rockfalls, maimed by couplings, burned by steam. He had seen strikers beaten in the yards and families starved by low wages. He understood hardship as a necessary, if regrettable, component of progress. But this was different. This was a quiet, desperate battle fought, and for now, lost in the heart of his own machine. The sight struck a chord deep within him, a place he had thought long dead and buried under years of profit margins and balance sheets. It was a feeling he couldn't immediately name, a disquieting mix of awe and a fierce, unfamiliar surge of protectiveness. He heard Miller shuffling nervously behind him. "Sir, she was a passenger. Stranded. No ticket. She offered to work her way to Cheyenne." Julian's gaze remained fixed on the sleeping woman. He didn't need the details. He could read the story in the soot on her cheekbones and the blood on her hands. A mail-order bride, most likely. An arrangement gone sour. He'd seen it before, women arriving with hope in their eyes only to be met with disappointment, cruelty, or simply an empty platform. They were the forgotten casualties of westward expansion. Suddenly, the foreman from the maintenance crew, a burly man named Henderson who had come forward to help with a mechanical issue, lumbered into the cab. He saw the scene, his heavy brow furrowing in irritation. He didn't recognize Julian in the dim light and heavy coat. "Well, for crying out loud," Henderson grumbled, his voice a gravelly roar over the engine's hiss. He strode forward and reached down to grab the woman's shoulder. "Get up, girl. Your shift ain't over. You think this fire stokes itself?" Before his fingers could touch her, a hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. The grip was not powerful in its muscle, but in its absolute, unyielding authority. Henderson froze, his arm caught in a vice. He looked up, his eyes slowly adjusting, and his jaw went slack. Julian's voice was dangerously quiet, a sliver of ice in the warm cab. "Leave her be." Henderson snatched his hand back, as if he'd been burned. "Mr. Croft," he gasped, his face a sudden mask of fear and confusion. I didn't know." Julian didn't even look at him. His attention was wholly on the woman. He knelt, his expensive trousers heedless of the grime on the floor. Gently, as if handling the most delicate porcelain, he reached out. He hesitated for a second, then carefully brushed a stray strand of soot-stained hair from her cheek. She didn't stir. She was utterly lost to the world. He looked at Miller, at Henderson, at the grimy, functional brutality of the engine cab. And then he looked back at the woman who had faced it down until she could not stand. A decision, swift and unanalyzed, formed in his mind. This was not a problem of boiler pressure or stranded passengers. This was a problem of a different sort, and it was his. Without another word, he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. As he lifted her, her head lolled back against his shoulder, a soft, unconscious sigh escaping her lips. He turned, the woman held securely against his chest, and faced the two stunned railroad men. His face was a cold, unreadable mask, but his eyes held a fire more intense than the one in the boiler. "Find another way to keep the pressure up," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "My car." Now, he directed the last words to Pierce, who had materialized silently at the cab door, his face a perfect blank. Pierce simply nodded and moved to lead the way. As Julian carried her out of the engine and back into the raging blizzard, the wind whipping at them, her unconscious form sheltered by his body, he felt the strange, protective anger solidify into something else. Resolve. He didn't know who she was, or what story had brought her to this desperate state. He only knew that her fight was over. He had just taken it from her. Alara woke to the sensation of softness. It was a feeling so alien, so utterly foreign to the past days of her life, that for a moment she thought she must be dead. The iron floor of the engine cab, the hard bench of the station, the lumpy mattress in her rented room back east, all were gone. In their place was a mattress that seemed to be made of clouds and sheets of such fine, smooth linen they felt like cool water against her skin. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. Where was she? The last thing she remembered was the overwhelming warmth of the boiler, the hiss of the steam. Her eyes darted around the room. It was small, but exquisitely appointed. Polished wood walls gleamed in the soft, steady glow of an oil lamp. A small, plushly upholstered armchair sat in one corner. A thick, woven rug covered the floor. The rhythmic clatter and sway of the train was still there, but it was a gentle, muted rocking, not the bone-jarring rattle of the engine. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a simple, clean nightgown of soft flannel, not her own grimy dress. In her hands, she held them up in the lamplight. They were clean. The blisters were still there, angry and red, but they had been carefully lanced, slathered with a soothing, pungent salve, and wrapped in clean, white bandages. Someone had tended to her. Someone had brought her here. The memory of a man's gruff voice shouting at her to wake up surfaced, followed by nothing. A blank. She scrambled out of the bed, the floor cold beneath her bare feet. A heavy curtain covered the doorway. She pushed it aside and stepped into a larger chamber that took her breath away. It was a drawing room on wheels. Velvet curtains, a large desk laden with maps and ledgers, bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a small table set for one with gleaming silver and a plate of covered food. A man stood with his back to her, staring out the window at the passing landscape. The blizzard had passed. A pale, watery sunlight was breaking over a vast, snow-dusted plain. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his posture radiating an aura of absolute command. He must have heard her, because he turned. It was the man from the engine cab. No, that wasn't right. She had no memory of him. And yet, there was a flicker of something, a sense of having been in his presence while not truly being there. He had cool, intelligent gray eyes that assessed her in a single, swift glance. There was no warmth in them, but no malice either. It was the look of a man accustomed to observing, to calculating. "You're awake," he said. His voice was the one she'd heard in the cab, the quiet, authoritative one that had cut through the foreman's bellow. "Please, seat. You must be hungry." Alara's first instinct was to flee. Her second was pride. She was not some charity case to be taken in and fed like a stray cat. She wrapped her arms around herself, keenly aware of the borrowed nightgown. "Where am I? Who are you?" "You are in my private car," he said, gesturing to the armchair near the table. "And my name is Julian Croft. This is my train." The name meant nothing to her, but the ownership of the train certainly did. He was the man in charge, the king of this rolling kingdom. This was a man who had found her collapsed and filthy in the engine. A hot flush of shame washed over her. I apologize, sir," she stammered, her voice hoarse. "For my condition. I had an arrangement with the engineer." "I'm aware of the arrangement," he said, his tone even. "You fulfilled your part of the bargain. The engine's pressure never dropped. You kept this train alive." He paused, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to her bandaged hands. "At considerable cost to yourself." He moved to the table and lifted the silver cover from the plate. The aroma of roasted chicken and warm bread filled the small space, and Alara's stomach clenched with a hunger so fierce it was dizzying. "It is paid for," he said simply. "Eat." It was a command, not an invitation. Wary, but too weak and hungry to refuse, she moved to the armchair and sat stiffly on its edge. She felt like a field mouse in a lion's den. As she began to eat, her movements clumsy and ravenous at first, then slower, more deliberate, he retrieved a crumpled piece of paper from his desk. "This was in the pocket of your dress," he said, holding it out. She recognized it instantly. It was the letter from Silas. The letter that had been her beacon of hope for months, now just a flimsy, pathetic record of her folly. She didn't take it. He didn't come, she said, her voice flat. She didn't need to look at it. She had the words memorized. A good plot of land. A sturdy house. I need a wife who is practical and not afraid of work. Enclosed is your ticket to Bitter Creek Station. I see, Julian said. He didn't press the letter on her. He simply folded it and placed it back on the desk. He poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher and set one beside her plate. He took the other and sat in the chair opposite his desk, creating a space between them that was both intimate and vast. For a while, the only sounds were the clink of her fork against the plate and the rhythmic rumble of the wheels on the track. The food was a miracle, restoring not just her strength, but some small measure of her composure. When she was finished, she placed the fork neatly on the plate and folded her hands in her lap. "Thank you, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice stronger now. I'm very grateful. For the food and for the medical attention." She met his gaze directly. "I can work to repay you for the cost of the salve and the bandages." A flicker of something, surprise, amusement, crossed his features before being suppressed. "That will not be necessary. Consider it a bonus for services rendered to the Great Western Rail." He leaned forward slightly. "What is your name?" "Alara," she said. "Alara Vance." "And what were your plans in Cheyenne, Miss Vance?" Once you arrived, the question hung in the air. She had no plans. Her only plan had been to get there, to find some kind of work. Al Shelmstresh, al Londresh, al Scholarly Maid. Anything. The humiliation of her situation rose in her throat again, hot and choking. "I plan to find employment," she said, her chin lifting a fraction. Julian Croft studied her, his gray eyes missing nothing. The proud set of her jaw, the tremor she was trying to hide in her bandaged hands, the fear she was trying to mask with defiance. He saw a resilience that fascinated him. She wasn't weeping or begging for help. She was battered but unbroken. He thought of the simpering, manipulative women of his own social circle in New York, women who used tears as weapons and fragility as a shield. Then he looked at Alara Vance, who had shoveled coal for 12 hours to save a train full of strangers, and felt a profound, startling sense of respect. "The crew will be talking," he said, shifting the topic. "Henderson, the foreman you met. Miller, they know I brought you here. The story will likely become embellished by the time we reach Cheyenne." Alara's heart sank. She understood his meaning perfectly. A rich, powerful man taking a destitute young woman into his private car. There was only one conclusion the world would draw. Her reputation, the only thing she had left, was already being shredded. "I see," she said quietly. She stood up, her posture straight and dignified despite the borrowed nightgown. "Then I should trouble you no longer. If you could have someone return my dress, I will move to the public passenger car. Your dress is being cleaned, and it is not fit for this weather," he said calmly. "And the passenger cars are unheated. You would be ill before we travel another 50 miles. He paused, letting his words sink in. "You will stay here. There is a small berth through that door. It is private. You will be my guest until we reach Cheyenne." "Mr. Croft, I cannot." "Miss Vance," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You are in no position to argue, and frankly, I am in no mood to do so. You are under my protection. That is the end of the matter." It was the most astonishing, high-handed, and strangely comforting thing anyone had ever said to her. Under his protection. The words hung in the air, a shield against the world she hadn't known she needed until this very moment. She looked at this stern, powerful man, a man who could buy and sell whole towns, and for the first time since stepping off the train at Bitter Creek, she felt a flicker, not of hope, but of something far more tentative and fragile: safety. She gave a small, stiff nod. "As you wish, sir." He nodded in return, a brisk, businesslike gesture, as if they had just concluded a contract. He turned back to the window, his posture once again that of the distant, commanding railroad president. But Alara saw the way his shoulders relaxed just a fraction, and she retreated to the small, safe berth he had given her, her mind reeling. She had struck a bargain with an engineer for passage and ended up in the care of a king. and she had no idea what it meant. The next 2 days were a strange, suspended reality. Alara remained mostly in her small, private compartment, a space that was larger and more comfortable than any room she had ever rented. Pierce, the silent steward, would bring her meals on a tray, along with fresh water for washing and a selection of books from Mr. Croft's library. Her own dress was returned to her, cleaned and expertly mended in a way that made the worn fabric look almost respectable. She felt like a princess in a tower, albeit a tower that was hurtling across the American continent at 40 miles an hour. Julian Croft kept his distance. He was consumed by his work, spending hours bent over the maps and ledgers on his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration. He would often pace the length of the car, dictating telegrams to Pierce, who would scribble them down in shorthand to be dispatched at the next station. The telegrams were a staccato rhythm of command and control. Delay shipment of Wyoming timber, stop awaiting new price schedule. Meet with Senator Reed in Denver Re. Land grants. Fire Supervisor Henderson at Bitter Creek Yard. Incompetence and cruelty unacceptable. That last one gave Alara a jolt. Henderson, the foreman who had tried to manhandle her. Fired. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't even spoken of the incident. Mr. Croft had simply witnessed it and acted. The justice was swift, impersonal, and absolute. It was a chilling glimpse into the power he wielded. Yet, there were moments when the wall between their two worlds became thin. In the evenings, after Pierce had cleared the dinner service, Julian would sometimes put aside his work. He wouldn't invite her to join him, not directly, but he would leave the door to the main car open and sit in one of the velvet armchairs, reading. The silence was not awkward, but companionable. One evening, he looked up from his book and found her watching him from her doorway. "Did you find a copy of Ivanhoe to your liking, Miss Vance?" he asked, his tone unexpectedly mild. She was startled that he'd noticed which book she had chosen. "Yes, sir. Very much. Though I find Rebecca to be a far more compelling character than the fair Rowena." A genuine smile touched Julian's lips, a rare event that transformed his stern features, making him look younger, more approachable. A controversial but astute observation. "Most agree with you, though few would have admitted it in Sir Walter Scott's day." He closed his book, marking his page with a finger. "You are well read." It was a statement, not question. "My father was a schoolmaster," she said quietly. "He believed books were a cure for most of life's ills, poverty and heartache included." And was he right? Alara considered the question. "They are not a cure," she said finally, "but they are a fine anesthetic." The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of thoughtful consideration. He saw her not just as the soot-stained girl from the engine, not just as a piece of human flotsam he had rescued, but as a person with a history, with an educated mind. He began to see the keen intelligence behind her quiet demeanor. The next day, he broke his routine. He knocked on the frame of her open door. "Miss Vance, I require some assistance, if you are feeling recovered enough." She stood immediately. "Of course, sir." He led her to his desk, which was littered with a chaotic jumble of shipping manifests, payroll ledgers, and correspondence. "My usual clerk was taken ill in Omaha. Pierce does his best, but his talents lie elsewhere. I need these documents sorted and cataloged by date and point of origin. It is tedious work." "I don't mind tedious work, Mr. Croft," she said, and he had the grace to look momentarily chagrined, remembering exactly how he knew that to be true. She set to the task with a quiet efficiency that impressed him. Her handwriting was neat and clear. She grasped the complex system of routing and logistics with an intuitive speed that his Ivy League-educated clerk had taken months to master. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, her focus absolute. Julian sat at the other side of the desk, ostensibly working on his own papers, but he found his attention drifting, watching the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the deftness of her now-healed hands as they shuffled the papers, the quiet competence that seemed to radiate from her. He was a man who appreciated competence above all else. He had built his empire on it, and here it was, in the most unexpected of packages. He felt a growing sense of frustration, not with her, but with the world that had seen fit to discard such a person. The thought of her married to some faceless farmer named Silas, her sharp mind dulled by domestic drudgery, began to feel like a criminal waste. The train slowed as it approached North Platte, a significant depot where they would take on water and supplies. Julian stood and stretched. "We will be stopping for an hour. Perhaps you would care for a short walk on the platform. The air might do you good." It was the first time she had been invited to step outside the car since he had brought her into it. She felt a knot of anxiety. Out there, they would be seen. The whispers he had warned her about would become real. But the thought of fresh, clean air was too tempting to resist. "I would like that very much," she said. When she stepped onto the platform at his side, she felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. Crewmen stopped their work to stare. Passengers from the other cars peered from their windows. The station master, a fussy, important little man, hurried toward them, his gaze flicking from the imposing figure of Julian Croft to the slight, unknown woman at his side. The gossip was a palpable, living thing in the air. Alara kept her eyes forward, her back straight, her expression neutral, mimicking the cool composure of the man beside her. "Mr. Croft, an honor, sir. An unexpected honor," the station master chirped. "Is there anything your line requires?" "Our needs are being met, Mr. Daniels," Julian said coolly. "My assistant and I are merely stretching our legs." "My assistant." The words were deliberate, a shield thrown up around her. It defined her role, gave her a legitimate reason to be there. It was a public declaration, a quiet act of defiance against the whispers. Alara felt a surge of gratitude, so strong it almost buckled her knees. He hadn't needed to do that. He could have let the rumors fly, but he had chosen to protect her name. As they walked the length of the platform, a man stepped out of the station house, his face lighting up with unpleasant recognition. It was Henderson, the fired foreman. His clothes were rumpled, and he smelled faintly of cheap whiskey. He saw Alara, and his face twisted into a sneer. Well, he said loudly, making sure the nearby crewman could hear. "Look at you. Landed on your feet, didn't you? Trading a coal shovel for a velvet pillow." Alara froze, the blood draining from her face. Julian stopped beside her. He didn't look at Henderson. He continued to gaze down the length of the track, as if the man didn't exist. "Mr. Daniels," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air, "I believe there's a piece of refuse cluttering your platform. See to it." The station master turned purple. He scurried over to Henderson, hissing at him to be silent, to leave at once. Henderson, cowed by the presence of the president and the fury of the station master, shot Alara one last hateful look and slunk away. The incident was over in seconds, but it left Alara trembling. The illusion of safety in the private car was shattered. The world was still out there, judgmental and cruel. Julian turned to her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the fear in her eyes. "He is a bitter man who lost his position due to his own failings," he said, his voice low. "His words have no meaning. To you, perhaps," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I am not you, Mr. Croft. I do not have a railroad to hide behind." The truth of her words struck him. He lived in a fortress of his own making, insulated by wealth and power. She had nothing but the dignity he was, moment by moment, trying to help her preserve. Without thinking, he reached out and placed his hand gently on her arm. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of reassurance. A simple, human touch. "As long as you are with me," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet intensity she had never heard from him before, "you will not need one." They stood there for a long moment on the crowded platform, the world of gossip and judgment fading into the background. In that moment, something shifted between them. The arrangement of protector and protected, of employer and assistant, deepened into something more personal, more complex. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was becoming her champion. And she was no longer just a project to him. She was becoming a necessity. The whistle blew, a long, mournful cry signaling their departure. They turned and walked back to the Atlas, the space between them now charged with a new and unspoken understanding. The final destination of Cheyenne loomed closer, and with it, the terrifying reality of their separate worlds. The temporary sanctuary of the train was coming to an end, and neither of them knew what would happen when it did. As the train steamed westward into Nebraska, a fragile domesticity began to settle within the confines of the Atlas. The master and servant dynamic softened, replaced by a routine of shared work and quiet companionship. Alara's role as assistant became less a pretense and more reality. She took over the management of Julian's correspondence, her sharp mind cutting through the dense legalese and financial jargon with surprising ease. She developed a system for his files, bringing order to the chaotic mess on his desk. Julian found himself watching her, fascinated. He would deliberately give her a complex freight routing problem, one that had stumped his managers, and watch as she spread the maps on the floor, her brow furrowed in concentration, and devised a solution that was both elegant and efficient. She had a mind for logistics, for seeing the patterns in a system that was as natural as breathing. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked one afternoon, after she had untangled a particularly nasty scheduling conflict involving 3 separate lines and a shortage of cattle cars. She looked up from the map, a faint flush on her cheeks. "My father used to say the world was just a series of paths, Mr. Croft. Some for people, some for rivers, some for ideas. The trick is to find the one with the fewest obstacles," she shrugged, as if it were a simple matter. "A railroad is no different. It's just a path made of steel." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not Alara Vance, the abandoned mail-order bride, but a woman of formidable intellect and untapped potential. The injustice of her situation struck him anew, harder this time. The man, Silas, who had summoned her, had asked for a wife who was practical and not afraid of work. He had no idea of the treasure he had so carelessly discarded. Julian felt a sharp, possessive anger toward this faceless man, this fool. Their conversations grew longer, stretching into the evenings. They spoke of the books they had read, of the changing country they were traveling through, of the future of the West. He found himself telling her things he told no one. His frustrations with the short-sightedness of politicians in Washington, his dreams of a rail line that would push north into the timberlands of Oregon, the crushing loneliness of a life spent in boardrooms and negotiations. She, in turn, began to open up to him. She spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of her schoolmaster father who had filled her head with poetry and her heart with a yearning for a world larger than her small town. She spoke of the desperation that had led her to answer a mail-order bride advertisement, the hope that had carried her 1,000 miles, and the bleak emptiness of the Bitter Creek platform. She told her story not with self-pity, but with a simple, stark honesty that he found more moving than any display of tears. One night, as a sea of stars glittered in the vast, dark sky outside the window, she asked him a question. "Why did you do it, Mr. Croft?" He knew immediately what she meant. "Do what?" he asked, though it was a pretense. "Help me," she said, her voice soft. "In the engine that night. You could have left me there. You could have given me $10 and sent me on my way in Cheyenne. Why bring me here?" Julian stared out at the dark plains, the reflection in the glass showing a man he barely recognized anymore. The ruthless industrialist was gone, replaced by someone more thoughtful, more weary. "I'm not entirely certain, Miss Vance," he admitted, the honesty costing him more than he would have thought. "When I was a boy, my father lost our farm. We had nothing. I remember the look in my mother's eyes, a kind of quiet despair, hidden behind a fierce pride. She would have done anything to keep us fed, to keep our family from splintering." He paused, the memory still raw after all these years. "When I saw you in that engine cab, asleep with your hands, I saw the same fire, the same pride. And I suppose I did for you what no one was able to do for my mother." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, precious thing. Alara felt her throat tighten. In that moment, he was not Julian Croft, the railroad president. He was just a man, haunted by a past he couldn't change, trying to right an old wrong in the present. She saw the loneliness that clung to him like a second skin, the immense burden of the empire he had built. She would have been proud of you, Alara whispered. He turned from the window, his gray eyes locking with hers. The professional distance was gone, incinerated in the heat of his admission. What remained was a connection, deep and profound, forged in a freezing engine cab and tempered over days of shared solitude. The air in the car crackled with unspoken emotions, with the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of what was growing between them. The next morning, they crossed the border into Wyoming. Cheyenne was only a day away. The reality of their arrival descended like a shroud. The sanctuary was ending. The world was waiting. Alara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. What would happen to her? She would not, accept charity from him. But the thought of leaving the strange, protected world of the Atlas, of leaving him, was a physical ache in her chest. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet rumble of his voice, to the unexpected moments of shared understanding. She was terrified of what her life would be without it. Julian felt it too. The impending arrival in Cheyenne felt less like a destination and more like a cliff's edge. The thought of walking Alara to the station door, pressing a handful of money into her hand, and watching her walk away was unbearable. It felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of the man she was helping him become again. The negotiations, the land grants, the entire purpose of his trip seemed trivial, insignificant compared to the decision that now faced him. As the train pulled into a small watering stop just hours outside the city, he knew he could not delay any longer. He found her standing by the window, watching the raw, brown hills of Wyoming slide by. Alara, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal Miss Vance attached. She turned, her eyes wide and questioning. I cannot simply leave you in Cheyenne, he said, his voice taut with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The thought is unacceptable to me. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Mr. Croft, I cannot. Let me finish, he said, holding up a hand. He took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into deep water. This position, my assistant, it is no longer a temporary measure, if you will have it. I need you, not just for your mind, which is sharper than any I have ever employed, but for your presence. Your counsel. He was fumbling, the words clumsy and inadequate for the enormity of what he was trying to say. I'm asking you to stay, he said, the words finally coming out, raw and simple. Continue with me. We will proceed to Denver after Cheyenne, then onward to San Francisco. Your role will be official. Your salary will be commensurate with your duties. You will have a place. It was more than she could have ever dreamed of. A job, a purpose, a future. But she heard the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. He was offering her a profession, a shield against the world, but there was a deeper, more personal plea in his eyes. He was not just offering her a position in his company. He was offering her a position in his life. She looked at him, at this powerful, lonely man who had shown her more kindness and respect than she had ever known. She thought of the life that awaited her without him, a bleak existence of servitude, of anonymity, of constantly looking over her shoulder. Then she looked at the future he was offering, one of challenge, of purpose, and of companionship with the one person on earth who saw her for exactly who she was. The fear in her stomach was still there, but now it was mingled with a thrilling, terrifying hope. The choice was hers. For the first time, her fate was not being decided by a failed farmer or a desperate circumstance. It was hers to command. Mr. Croft. Julian, she corrected herself, testing his name on her tongue. It felt right. I have no destination in mind, she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of a newfound strength. Except forward. A slow smile spread across his face, the smile that reached his eyes and erased the years of weariness. Forward then, he said. The train's whistle blew, and the wheels began to move again, carrying them toward Cheyenne. But it was no longer a place of endings. It was the beginning. They were heading into a confrontation with the world, but this time they would face it together. The arrival in Cheyenne was as chaotic and overwhelming as Alara had feared. The station was a swarm of humanity, ranchers in dusty Stetsons, slick-looking speculators in city suits, women in fine dresses, and rough-looking men whose eyes lingered on a woman traveling alone. But this time, she was not alone. When Julian stepped down from the Atlas, he turned and offered her his hand. It was a simple, public gesture, but it spoke volumes. It declared to the entire world that she was with him. They were met by a delegation of city fathers, men with portly stomachs and self-important airs. Their eyes widened almost comically when they saw Alara at Julian's side, but his cool, dismissive glare dared any of them to comment. He introduced her simply as my associate, Miss Vance, and the topic was closed. They were escorted to the finest hotel in the city, the Interocean, a brick monolith that proclaimed Cheyenne's aspirations to be a capital of the West. Julian had reserved a suite, which, to Alara's profound relief and unspoken gratitude, included a small but separate adjoining room for her. The pretense of assistant was being maintained with scrupulous, respectful care. The next day was a whirlwind of meetings for Julian. Alara remained in the suite, organizing his notes, drafting his responses to a stack of telegrams, and acting as a formidable gatekeeper to the stream of callers who came to seek an audience with the railroad president. She discovered she had a talent for it, for deflecting the insincere and prioritizing the important. She felt a sense of purpose, of worth, that was intoxicating. But beneath the surface of their new professional arrangement, the personal connection deepened. Over dinner in their private dining room, he would recount the day's frustrations, the greed and duplicity of the men he dealt with. He spoke to her not as an employee, but as a confidant, an equal. He valued her opinion, her sharp, incisive observations cutting through the bluster and getting to the heart of the matter. "You have a clearer eye for a man's character than anyone I know," he told her one evening, his voice laced with admiration. "Perhaps it is because I have had more reason to learn," she replied quietly, and he understood all the things she wasn't saying. The main event of their visit was a formal dinner and reception hosted by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. It was a gathering of the most powerful men in the territory, the cattle barons and land speculators who were the uncrowned kings of the plains. Julian's attendance was essential, and he was insistent that Alara accompany him. "You are my right hand in this, Alara," he'd said, leaving no room for her protests. "I need you there." Pierce, the ever-resourceful steward, had been dispatched and had returned with several ready-made gowns from the city's best dressmaker for her to choose from. Alara chose the simplest one, a deep emerald green silk that shimmered in the light, with long sleeves and a modest, high neckline. When she emerged from her room, ready for the dinner, Julian, who was waiting for her in the sitting room, stopped breathing for a moment. He had seen her covered in soot, seen her in a simple, mended dress, seen her focused and professional. He had never seen her like this. The gown turned her eyes to chips of jade and highlighted the quiet, graceful dignity of her posture. She was not merely pretty, she was magnificent. All traces of the destitute girl on the train platform were gone, replaced by a woman of stunning poise and confidence. "You look," he started, his voice rough, but he couldn't find the word. Adequate was an insult. Beautiful felt too personal, a line he had not yet dared to cross. He settled for ready. She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "And you, Mr. Croft, look as though you were going into battle." He was. The ballroom of the Interocean was a battlefield of wealth and influence. The air was thick with the smoke of expensive cigars and the scent of whiskey. Men with hard eyes and sun-scorched faces sized each other up, their conversations a low rumble of cattle prices and land disputes. Their wives, draped in jewels and French fabrics, watched from the sidelines, their own battles fought with sharp glances and whispered gossip. When Julian Croft entered with Alara on his arm, a wave of silence rippled through the room. Every eye turned to them. They were a striking couple. He, with his silver-streaked hair and aura of immense power. She, with her understated elegance and mysterious, quiet beauty. The question was on everyone's lips. Who was she? Julian navigated the room with practiced ease, introducing Alara with the same cool, unassailable title. My associate, Miss Vance, he guided her through a minefield of inquisitive glances and barely veiled questions. Alara, for her part, held her head high, her composure a perfect match for his. She was a quick study, listening more than she spoke, her intelligent eyes taking in the power dynamics of the room. And then she saw him. He was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by a group of sycophantic-looking men. He was taller than she'd imagined, with a handsome but weak face and an air of smug self-satisfaction. Her blood ran cold. It was Silas, but not Silas Croft, as the letter had been signed. A banner behind him announced the major sponsors of the event, and there, in bold letters, was the name, Silas Mercer, Mercer Land and Cattle Company. He had lied about his name, a common enough trick for a man wishing to avoid entanglement if his bride-to-be proved unsuitable. At that moment, his eyes swept the room and landed on her. Recognition dawned, followed by a flash of disbelief, and then a dark, ugly flush of anger. He had discarded her, left her for dead, and here she was, on the arm of the most powerful man in the territory. He excused himself from his group and began to push his way through the crowd toward them. Alara's hand tightened on Julian's arm. "Julian," she whispered the name of plea. He followed her gaze and saw the man approaching, his face a mask of arrogant fury. "Who is he?" Julian asked, his voice a low growl. "Silas," she breathed, "the man from the letter." Julian's entire posture shifted. The cool businessman vanished, replaced by something harder, more primal. He placed his hand over hers on his arm, a gesture of silent, unshakable support. Silas Mercer stopped in front of them, his eyes spitting venom at Alara. He ignored Julian completely. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The surrounding conversations faltered as people turned to watch. "Look what the cat dragged in. I send you packing because you're not fit to be a rancher's wife, and you turn up here. You certainly trade up, don't you? Found yourself a wealthier benefactor, have you?" The insult was brutal, its implication clear and vile. He was calling her a prostitute in front of the most influential people in Wyoming. Alara felt the blood drain from her face, the room tilting around her. But before she could even gasp, Julian stepped forward slightly, shielding her. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring quiet of the ballroom like a shard of glass. "You must be Mr. Mercer," he said, his tone deceptively mild. "I've been reviewing your company's shipping contracts. They are, to be frank, a mess. Much like your manners." Silas was taken aback, his face turning from red to purple. "You have no right." "I have every right," Julian interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerously cold level. "I own the railroad your cattle travel on. But we are not here to discuss your professional incompetence. We are here to discuss your personal failings, which appear to be even more egregious." He gestured toward Alara, who stood, stunned, behind the shield of his body. "You mistake good fortune for character, Mr. Mercer. You judged this woman unworthy. You left her stranded, without a penny, hundreds of miles from anyone she knew, based on nothing more than your own shallow caprice. You broke a contract, and you abandoned a human being. In my world, we have names for men like that. None of them are fit for polite company." Julian's gaze swept the silent, watching crowd. "This woman," he continued, his voice ringing with absolute conviction, "shoveled coal for 12 hours in a blizzard to keep one of my trains from freezing on the tracks, saving the lives of the crew and passengers. She possesses more integrity and courage in her little finger than you have in your entire being. You didn't find her worthy? Sir, the truth is, you were never, not for a single moment, worthy of her." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a few shocked gasps. Silas Mercer stood, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, his face a mottled canvas of fury and utter humiliation. And then Alara found her voice. She stepped out from behind Julian, her fear gone, replaced by a cold, clear anger. She looked Silas Mercer directly in the eye, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You were right about one thing, Mr. Mercer," she said calmly. "I'm not fit to be your wife. I would have been miserable with a man who values a woman less than his own livestock, and whose character is as fraudulent as his name." She held his gaze for a beat longer. "I thank you for the favor you did me by not showing up." With that, she turned her back on him. Julian offered her his arm. She took it, her head held high. Together, they turned and walked through the stunned, silent crowd, which parted before them like the Red Sea. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. The battle was over. Silas Mercer was ruined, not by financial loss, but by a public vivisection of his character, performed by the two people he had wronged the most. As they stepped out of the ballroom and into the cool, quiet air of the hotel corridor, Elara knew she was no longer an abandoned bride. She was a survivor, and she was not alone. Back in the privacy of their suite, the silence was a living entity. The adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving behind a quivering, raw vulnerability. Elara walked to the window and stared down at the gaslit streets of Cheyenne, her reflection a ghostly image in the dark glass. Julian stood by the fireplace, watching her. The roles of president and assistant, of protector and protected, had been burned away in the crucible of the ballroom, leaving only a man and a woman. "He will be ruined," Elara said quietly, not turning around. "Men like Mercer ruin themselves," Julian replied, his voice low and steady. "They simply need a little help in the final act." He walked over to stand beside her at the window. "Are you all right?" She finally turned to face him. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears, but they were not tears of sadness or humiliation. They were tears of relief, of catharsis. "No one has ever stood for me like that before," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Ever. It was my privilege," he said, his own voice hoarse. The space between them was electric, charged with all the unspoken words, the shared glances, the quiet moments of connection that had been building since that first night on the train. The professional pretense that had been their shield was gone. There was nothing left to hide behind. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a single tear that escaped and traced a path down her skin. It was a gesture of infinite tenderness, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. "Elara," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his given name, used with an intimacy that made her heart ache. "My business in Cheyenne is concluded. The negotiations are done." He paused, his gray eyes searching hers, full of a hope so fierce it was almost painful to see. "But my journey, I find I'm not eager for it to end, nor am I eager for yours to begin without me." He took a breath, the confession laid bare between them. "I'm asking you to continue on with me. To Denver, to San Francisco, to wherever the tracks may lead. Not as my amanuensis, not as my associate." He swallowed, the final words costing him everything. "As my partner, in all things." It wasn't a proposal of marriage in the conventional sense. It was something far more profound. It was a proposal of a shared life, a shared future, built not on a contract or convenience, but on mutual respect, admiration, and a deep, abiding affection that had grown in the most unlikely of circumstances. Elara looked out the window at the vast, dark country that stretched to the horizon. She had come west seeking a home, a place to belong. She had thought it would be a plot of land, a sturdy house. She had been wrong. Home wasn't a place. It was a person. It was the feeling of being seen, of being valued, of being safe. It was the feeling she had when she was with him. Her past was a ghost on a train platform in Bitter Creek. Her future was here, standing before her, his heart in his eyes. For the first time, that future was not a terrifying unknown, but a thrilling adventure. She turned back to him, her hand rising to cover his where it rested on her cheek. A small, genuine smile, the first one that had reached her eyes since she had left Pennsylvania, finally bloomed on her face. "I have no destination in mind, Julian," she said, her voice clear and strong, "except forward." He closed his eyes for a moment, a wave of profound relief washing over his features. When he opened them again, His smile mirrored hers. He took her other hand, the hand that was once blistered and raw from shoveling coal, now healed and strong, and raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to the back of it. The simple, formal gesture was imbued with all the devotion and promise of a vow. Outside, a train whistle blew, a long, lonely sound in the night. But for the two people standing in the warm light of the hotel room, it was not a sound of departure or solitude. It was a call to the horizon, a promise of the journey they were about to begin together. The contract was over. The rescue was complete. A new, far grander adventure was just beginning, on a path of steel into the heart of the West. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen.